in terms of that policy. And we argue that it's done some things very, very well. For instance, it has allowed many different actors to become involved. But at the same time, we also believe that what they've done is not sufficiently democratic, open, and it's effectively what we call post-political. What I find even more interesting than this is that the UK government has no vision, no ideas about what's going to happen after this phase of experimentation. There is still the assumption that the market will take over and that these innovations will be scaled up without or with very limited government support. And I think we see something similar in the US as well. Now, the history of innovation in transport tells us that's a very tricky assumption. Look at what's happening with EVs, for instance. There's hardly any country that has a sort of where EVs are really scaling. Norway is the only example, and that's because they have a very set of aggressive policy instruments in place. So if the UK is really committed to automation, it needs to think about what's going to be the medium-term policy landscape to facilitate this transition. And what we argue is that what may be actually much more likely is that we get a much more gradual reconfiguration of the existing systems, the existing sociotechnical system, where some elements of automation may be incorporated into existing configurations, rather than sort of this more dramatic change transformation that we see here. And actually what we see happening in freight transport, particularly interurban in the UK, is what we call a whole series of micro-automations, where you get all kinds of smaller innovations that basically mean that the sector is much more automated than it would appear at first sight. So things like telematics, blind spot detection systems, digital signaling, automatic gear changes, apps for vehicle checks, all kinds of IT applications have already migrated into this vehicle and are moving into this vehicle, so that it already becomes not quite an autonomous or an automated connected vehicle, but something that is much more connected and much more IT mediated than we would think of. Again, really important to stress, this whole idea that the driver will disappear seems very unlikely in the UK context, and I'm very interested to hear what you think, what might happen in the US context. I think we will see that people are able to navigate sort of the increasingly stringent labour laws in the UK and in the EU, but whether that will also improve working conditions remains an open question. However, at the same time, whilst I think the transition or the change will be much more gradual, I think we should not sort of forget or disregard the potential of changes that are much more radical than we currently can envision because of, for instance, shocks or surprises, or another set of more gradually operating pressures that may sort of occur between now and sort of 20, 25 years from now. And I think labour regulation is going to be very, very important, at least in the UK case. Environmental regulation and strengthening of regulation around emissions in particular. And I think we haven't seen the best of public resistance against some of the changes that we've been talking about today. So, in conclusion, what I would like to suggest is that expectations about automation in goods mobility are quite diverse, and there's much more to them than would appear on first sight. I think it's really important to understand goods mobility as a socio-technical system and really take into account its wider political economy. And once you do that, you'll see that this transition becomes much more difficult, and that much of the optimism may not be appropriate. And I think what we'll see is a much more gradual and selective incorporation of automation in many places. I actually think it's very appropriate that we have this session in the port, because I think ports are one of the sites where we'll see some of these processes of automation happening much more quickly and on a much grander scale than we'll see in urban traffic. However, I can't tell you the future. The future is open, and we should really sort of respect that, and we should really not close our eyes for any black swans that may occur. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. So what we'll do, because the drinks got here a little bit late, is just give you guys a moment to go grab a drink, get back to your seat, and I'll invite the speakers up here, and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A.